the research that I've been doing that is trying to understand what is the scope of transformation that is being engendered by the sharing economy. So when I tell my colleagues that I'm really interested in peer-to-peer sharing, they're puzzled. They say, well, do you mean someone lending someone their car? And I say, no, it's different. I mean, this is powered by the internet. Then they say, oh, you mean Craigslist? And so I say, no, it's not really as simple as Craigslist. It's a little more complex than that. And I'd advise you to sort of keep your eyes to the right. That's where all the interesting stuff is. This is what Craigslist looks like in New York. So what's happening now is that, as you guys know, we've moved so much further than Craigslist in facilitating the sharing of assets across people that, this picture is from 2012 and illustrates sort of all of the specialized sort of peer-to-peer asset and time-sharing marketplaces that have emerged that we are collectively calling the sharing economy, right? Now, to me, at the heart of what's different about these marketplaces relative to, sort of the Craigslist-like forums that preceded them, is what's sitting inside that cloud. It's that we have, over the last 15 years, seen a shift in the focus of technology companies. It used to be that in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, the focus of technology companies was on business and government. Products were developed for business or for government, and then the consumer, people like you and me, were an afterthought. We've seen a reversal of that trend, where we're now witnessing what people call the consumerization of digital technology, where products are developed for consumers and then adapted for businesses. And so to me, this is a big part of why we're seeing this transition. Mobile devices, social networks, online review systems, all of these come out of this consumerization. And what they do is that they start to bring real-world assets, things like the relationships we have in the real world, our real-world identity, the ability to learn from someone else's experience, online reviews, online social networks, real-world identities online. What does it mean when these things come online? Well, we have a much greater level of trust facilitated. And if you look at sort of the economy historically, when there's a change in the trust mechanisms that underlie exchange between people, you start to see a shift in what is possible in the economy. So starting from this point of now we have hundreds of specialized marketplaces and other institutions that are facilitating economic exchange between people, powered by online digital trust. The question that I'm asking is, well, what will the economic impacts of this be? So here's my framework for thinking about what the economic impacts are. On one side, you have the demand shifts. And the demand shifts have three different components to them. First of all, you have expanded consumption. So I put consumption in quotes there because don't think of it as necessarily utilizing the asset. It could be usage. Doesn't mean that it gets over after you consume it. But it's not just people sort of shifting their consumption or their usage from, oh, I'm going to own it, to let me sort of use it in a shared way. Once you have access to shared assets, you're increasing the scope and variety of things dramatically. And historically, when you have an increase in variety, you have an increase in economic activity. Next, you have productivity gains. When you're using your assets more efficiently, it increases what economists call productivity. And one of the things, we economists disagree about a lot of things, but one of the things we all agree on are that productivity gains lead to economic growth. And that's a really important observation because a lot of the people I talk to about the sharing economy say, well, if people start to buy less stuff, won't that slow down the economy? If you're getting more efficient, isn't that going to slow down the economy? And I say, well, let's look at history. Productivity gains tend to lead to economic growth. Increases in variety tend to lead to economic growth. Now, as we start to share our assets, share our money, share our skills, share our production capabilities, what we're also starting to see is a shift in doing things for money away from professionals and towards people who used to do it simply for personal reasons. Let me give you an example, because this is sort of at the heart of both the economic transformation and the regulatory challenges that come later. If you pick up a friend from the airport, you don't need a specialized permit for that. You don't need specialized training for that. If you drive your family around in your car, you are taking people around, but that doesn't sort of necessitate any specialized sort of designation. On the other hand, if you want to do this for money, in the old economy, you needed to get a license, you needed to get a taxi permit. That was because the lines between doing things for personal reasons and doing things professionally were very clearly drawn. What we're seeing now is a blending of this personal and commercial. And to me, that is a thread that goes across not just sort of asset sharing, but production on sites like Etsy, the sharing of money on sites like Kickstarter, the sharing of skills on sites like Skillshare. All of these have through them this thread of the merging of personal with commercial. And I think this is at the heart of a lot of the regulatory challenges. So when governments step into a marketplace and say, hey, we need to intervene and make this marketplace work better, generally they do it because the market can't manage itself. Right? You want the government to step in and help something along, whether it's sort of ensuring safety or whether it's making sure that people sort of actually exchange. The role of government here has typically been as an intervention. I step in if the market can't take care of itself. The government steps in to prevent market failure. What we're starting to see is that platforms are playing some of the same roles that the government used to in the sharing economy. I don't need metered fares in taxis if I've got GPS technology and a platform that can track my route. I don't necessarily need the government inspectors to come and inspect apartments that might be offered on Airbnb. If I've got an online review system that is going to weed out of the marketplace people who don't sort of conform. And so these mechanisms of trust that are powered by these online marketplaces are preventing market failure in the same way that we needed governments for. It's interesting because it may seem like sort of an isolated example. You might say, okay, fine, the review systems of Airbnb are helping us sort of rent apartments of Airbnb. The review systems of Lyft or Drivey are helping us sort of choose good cars. But this seems to be a more general trend. For the last decade, we have given that relationship between the people who produce music and the people who consume music. It used to be that the government decided, okay, if you were an artist, these were the rights that you kept. If you were a consumer of music, these are the rights that you buy when you buy music. If you buy a book, there are certain rights that you buy with it. Now, we've taken that division and we've handed it over to the DRM platforms, the digital rights management platforms like iTunes and Amazon. And so that's another example of the platform starting to do what the government does. The emergence of Bitcoin has made us realize that perhaps you don't need, a decade from now, a government to back a currency in order for it to be viable. The Ouishare platform has sort of shown us that you can get information from remote locations in a way that the government couldn't always do. Facebook and LinkedIn are replacing government systems as forms of identity. The UID project in India, digital identity for 1 billion people, again, platforms are taking over some of the roles that we historically needed governments for. So this is sort of a broader trend than just powering marketplaces like Airbnb. This is a shift in those trust and in those sort of reliability, sort of providing things. We used to need the government as a collective, and now the platforms are doing what the government used to. These platforms are also allowing us to make better use of existing institutions. And so if you can't get someone's ID completely from a platform like Facebook or LinkedIn, you can use that to connect to the identity infrastructure that the government has already set up. And so it's not just creating new institutions, but it's also sort of making existing institutions more efficient. And as we move from professional to commercial, from professional to personal, and as those lines between personal and commercial start to blur, again, we start to say, well, we've always had a certain standard for professional provision. We start to change those standards now. We start to say, well, if this is a person driving a car for 5 hours a week, maybe I'm not going to expect the same service. I'm not going to expect the same things from them that I would expect from a taxi driver. In my last couple of minutes, I just want to touch on a couple of other points that I think that are key trade-offs that we're making as we enter this transition. One is the trade-off between corporate ownership and ownership by the workers. In April alone, sharing economy platforms raised $852 million in venture capital. I mean, this is an insanely high amount for 1 month for one industry. What this is reflecting is the fact that a lot of the platforms that are powering the sharing economy are privately owned and headed towards being shareholder-owned corporations. This may sort of create the impression that perhaps the kind of sharing that, the kind of value system that underlies what we expect in a sharing economy may not actually emerge, because sharing does not necessarily lead to equity. To me, I think that this is a good development in the short run, because there are lots of regulatory battles to be fought. And what platforms like Airbnb and Uber are doing is that they are sort of clearing the regulatory landscape for this transition from professional to personal. And at some point in the future, we may well see the emergence of a worker cooperative in the ride-sharing industry. Now, a challenge that I think we need to address is that a lot of the sharing that we see happens to be between people who are within the same socioeconomic status. And I have a team of students from NYU Stern somewhere here who are working over this semester on trying to invent new models to make sharing more equitable, to try and figure out how can we transfer assets in a rental model, transfer capital in a rental model, from people who have a lot of it to people who don't have so much of it. To me, that would really unlock the economic potential of the sharing economy when we start to sort of cross these socioeconomic boundaries. Yes! So, a challenge that we're going to face is that as we sort of transition from this economy where people used to work for companies to an economy where people are now independent workers, there are lots of capabilities that these organizations used to provide. There are lots of protections, especially in the United States, that these organizations used to provide: health insurance, pensions, retirements. And as we move to being an economy where there are independent workers rather than people who work for companies, micro-entrepreneurs, we are going to need to sort of reinvent ways in which we fund society's collective needs. It's not going to come from corporate taxes as much as it used to, and so it's either going to have to come from the government, or we're going to have to invent new collectives, like the Freelancers Union, like Shareable, like peers, that are going to start to bridge some of these holes in the ecosystem. So I want to end with this thought. I'm pursuing quite actively and with sort of a number of collaborators research that is aiming to answer these questions. Should sharing economy platforms be owned by cooperatives, or should they be owned by corporations? What will the economic impacts be? What are the new collectives that are needed? And as an academic, I can only do so much. I need your help. So, I've seeded a new collaborative called the Peer Collaborative. You can find out more at the end of May. But I've got some partners, I've got some financial support. I'm getting a lot of data from the platforms that sort of like, are a big part of the sharing economy. And our goal is really to sort of shape thought as we sort of go through this economic transition from like, sort of a corporation-based economy to one in which a large fraction of exchange, of financing, of education, of production is from individuals interacting with other individuals. Anyway, so I'm delighted to be here in Paris. Thank you very much for your time.